Welcome to Epistemology Online, where the idea is to get people to articulate what they believe to be true and false, good and evil, and their rationale behind it. Hopefully a different way of discourse online. So I'm going to just start my timer, and if we get to the end and there's something you want to say past that, I'm not locked to the time, but it's just a handy little mechanism to kind of take the pressure off of, like, how long will this be?
Yeah.
So I'll kick that off. And so tell me, what's kind of your belief on wealth inequality? Like, what do you think? What do you see?
I think that there's a huge gap between the top 1% and basically everyone else. You can look up all the stats, but one of the biggest ones is that the top 1% owns 60% of the wealth in America, which is kind of crazy when you start thinking about what that actually means. It means that me and you, like, we're probably more likely to become a millionaire than the ultra wealthy are to downgrade to a millionaire. And that's kind of crazy. The more you think about it, the more frustrating it kind of gets. And I think that it's really unfair when we also have the same kind of statistics where 1 in 5 children don't know if they're going to be able to have a meal tonight, like they're food insecure. So the fact that these two realities kind of exist in one context and in one country is just kind of frustrating and doesn't quite make sense about why that is. We still have such poverty in a country with such wealth is kind of frustrating. And I think that there could be more done to make that not as much of a reality, or at least not as big of a divide.
Okay. I think I understand kind of what you're saying there. So if I'm going to kind of repeat what you said back and see if it all makes sense. So there's wealth inequality where something like a small percentage of people, like 1% of top earners, own a vast majority of wealth, which I would probably define as like valuable things like houses, dollars, gold and silver, microphones, whatever. They have a bunch of stuff. And I guess stocks in like a company, but that's kind of highfalutin stuff. And the kicker for you is that there's these people that have like these super high precipices of assets available to them. But at the same time, there are people that are literally maybe not being able to eat a meal because there's no food in like the fridge, or maybe there is no fridge or anything like that. Is that a fair way of putting that?
Right. And it's not the problem that there's people are able to get wealthy and they're still millionaires and stuff. The problem really is with billionaires who literally have so much money that they can't even spend it all. Like there's too much money that they literally can't do anything with. And so that kind of wealth is, I think, what's the problem. Less so than like a millionaire who might have started their own company and got their way and really did work to get to the top. I don't think that's necessarily a problem. But when you have someone who has so much money that they can't even spend it all, but also people that can't find a meal who live possibly even in the same city, I think that's where the biggest problem lies.
So if, let's say the latter half of that wasn't the case, like if everybody had food, shelter, water, clean air, and clothing, if those were not a factor, would that still be the case to you?
I mean, probably not, but that's just not the reality that we're living in. There's always going to be poorer people and there's always going to be richer people, but there are people that don't have access to basic human needs, just like you said, like food, water, shelter, a place to stay, and clean air. All of those things they just don't have access to and don't really have the ability to change their situation as well. They're kind of stuck there, and then the next generation is stuck there, and it's just an endless process. But I think, like I said, I think there will always be the rich and there will always be the poor, but it's kind of like, what does poor mean and what does rich mean? I think we could have better definitions of those.
Yeah, definitions would probably be really helpful whenever people talk about that. What do you suppose ought to be done to, let's assume that we had clearly defined, a rich person is X, a poor person is X, a person that doesn't need anything modified is X. What would you propose to be done to try to even that out, or whatever you would propose?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different like actual policy things that have been suggested, especially by like more progressive candidates like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, where they're proposing a wealth tax where basically the wealth that a person has would be taxed. So someone who's worth over $1 billion would be taxed on that amount instead of just their income taxes or just their asset taxes. But I think not just talking about policy, I think it comes down to a worldview. And that for me is where I kind of have a different lens than maybe other people don't have. So like I'm a Christian, like that's obviously going to affect how I view the world. And so I think that as a society, we should try to be better towards those who are the poorest. Now I know not everyone's a Christian, but we also founded this country on the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And as far as that goes, there are people in this country that are scared that they might not have enough food on the table, which means that it's affecting their life. They don't have the same freedoms and the same abilities to move up in society as other people, which is their liberty. And then obviously, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, you really don't have enough money or extra time to pursue happiness. So I think it's fundamental rights that a portion of our country just isn't able to get. So there's lots of different policy things that can help change that. But at the end of the day, it's also just a heart issue. Like, how do we view the poor and how do we view the rich?
So what, I guess, so that's kind of an overarching view. What is one specific thing that you might say, yeah, sign me up for that? Like, what's one thing specifically that, oh, there's the dog. You warned me. He's there. What's one specific thing that you would be like, yeah, count me in?
I think that a wealth tax would be a really good way to do that. So like I said, like right now, someone is only taxed on their income or on capital gains tax, which means that they've sold an asset and there's tax on that asset, but they're not necessarily taxed on their whole wealth. So if someone like Jeff Bezos, for example, if he just stopped, he sold Amazon and didn't sell any more assets after that, if he just was a nomad for a year, he wouldn't pay any taxes because he's a billionaire, but he has all this wealth that's just sitting there that's just not getting taxed. But I think the thing is that people are like, oh, you're just taking away all this money for free from these people, but it's like a 1% tax. It's not like we're putting them out on the street. They still have a lot of wealth, but that 1% just on the top 0.01% of the country could pay for free healthcare for everyone. It could pay for free college for the whole country. It's kind of a question of how are we using the resources in the country to the betterment of society. And so as far as how that gets done and if Congress would even pass something like that, that's a whole other question. But I think right now doing nothing and letting the richest percent of our society get tax breaks is not the best way to do it.
Okay. So is there kind of maybe a limit to what would be considered like you have now amassed enough wealth to be subject to this? Like, is it based on dollars? Is it what's kind of the underlying principle that you personally would advocate for? Not necessarily what somebody has proposed, but just what do you think would be fair?
I think personally it would be in the multiple billions of dollars. That's when you start getting to the amounts where you literally can't spend all of that in your lifetime. And you can pass it on to your kids, but they can make it even more. But I think as far as once we get into the multiple billions of dollars, that's when it should start getting a little bit more severe. Because as of right now, I forget what the exact number is, but once you reach a certain tax bracket, that's all the taxes you pay. And it's like in I think the low millions. So a millionaire and a billionaire are going to pay the same tax rates, even though there's such a huge divide between those two groups. So I think once you get into the billionaires is when I would start saying, are you actually doing the best with your money? Or is there something that we can do to better society with that money?
Gotcha. Is there any element of moral right and wrong whenever, can this be ever construed as like a moral right or a moral wrong? Like, let's say somebody said, if you make $1, it will be 100% taxed, and any dollars you make past $1 is 100% taxed. Could that be construed as morally wrong or hey, at this particular point, it's morally right because it's more reasonable or something like that?
I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily morally right or wrong, because a lot of it depends on what your view of government is and how much government should play in the role of a citizen. And obviously, there are people all over the spectrum on that. I think what is, if you just want to talk about morals, it's kind of more of an individual perspective. As far as like, how are you using your wealth? And again, I kind of come back to my Christian kind of lens that I look through this as, and like, they say that the love of money is the root of all evil. And I think that can be really true for a lot of people who mass such wealth and need to amass more and more wealth, that it can become a moral problem. But the same problem could be someone who only has $1,000 but puts all of their love in money. It can be a moral problem for them to just want to amass wealth. So the dollar amount doesn't count as much. It's more just what's your motivation of how you're using your money. And are you using it to help other people, or are you using it just to enrich yourself? So again, I think moral wise, it's more of an individual decision.
Gotcha. And I think you touched on an important component that really it boils down to what somebody thinks like the proper role of government may be. Because I think the person that I saw you talking to on Facebook is more on the more conservative side, and I'd put you more on the more liberal side. Is that a fair way of putting that? So what I guess we'd have to answer that to figure out all the downstream effects of that. So what is kind of your what is a government, and then what's the proper role of that within a group of people?
Yeah. So I think that, I mean, I look back to before we got to the Great Depression, there was no Social Security. There was no like safety net for people who became poor. It's just you become poor and you most likely could die because of that. But whenever Roosevelt made the New Deal, he made it to where the poor kind of have this safety net at the bottom where they're not necessarily going to die because they're poor. You know, we have Social Security, we have Medicare, Medicaid, all of these programs that the government created for poor people. So now they have the ability to get healthcare. Our senior citizens don't have to be in poverty whenever they're no longer able to work. And there's all these programs like that that help people get food stamps and the ability to get jobs and unemployment. So I think, sorry,
Okay.
I think all of those things are good things that the government can do. And if things were just everyone fend for yourself, the people who work the hardest and go the furthest and cut the most throats along the way are going to succeed. And if you don't, then you're just going to be poor. And that's the end of it. And I just think that that's not, first of all, fair, because we also know that there's so many different stereotypes and discrimination that goes on, that the playing field is not fair for everyone. I mean, as a woman, I didn't even get to vote until the 19th Amendment. And then we could talk about civil rights, and that's a whole different discussion. But basically, the playing field is not fair. So if you expect people who are on this unfair playing field to somehow be able to all succeed at the same levels without government intervention, it's just not possible. And I think the government can help with evening the fairness of social mobility, making it to where just because my parents were poor doesn't mean that I'm also going to be poor. But the government can help in the sense that it might fund my college to where I can go to college and better myself, and then I will have a better chance at life than my parents did, and so on and so forth. Whereas if the government didn't intervene, I wouldn't have been able to afford college, and I probably wouldn't make anything more than my parents did. So there's a lot that could go on there, but
Sure.
Basically, I think at the end of the day, government can be good when it wants to be.
So what is one of the things I was wondering earlier is what is kind of your definition of a government? Not necessarily the implementation of it is as it is now, or what's your view of it. How would you define the word government?
I mean, I could do the easy answer and say the body that governs, but basically, I think it would be the people at least in our society, the people that we elect to make the laws of the land and to make our society safe, but also a society where everyone is able to be able to do well. And it kind of goes back to like the Declaration of Independence, that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think the government is what enables all of the citizens to be able to have those things, and be able to have those evenly. And it doesn't always work out, and we've come a long way since, the 1770s. But I think at the end of the day, that would be the government's job, is to make sure the citizens have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Gotcha. Well, I mean, we're pretty much up on the 15 minutes. I'm happy to go another round if you're interested in that, but that's totally up to you.
Yeah, I mean, my dog is here chewing on my hand, but I'm down.
Yeah, if you need to take care of the dog for a sec, I'll cut the recording real quick. My hope is that people can start listening to what other people are saying and try to understand like how they're thinking. That's kind of my goal.